It occurred to me recently that I've actually been applying the Unix philosophy to all areas of my life without even realizing. So if you look back over my channel, I've done these videos exploring themes of convergence versus counterparts, and I've kind of referenced this specifically in terms of smartphones and multi-tools and even cars, but I didn't really make the connection that it was in fact still these principles from the Unix philosophy that I was using, and this is absolutely fascinating. So in this video, we're going to look at the Unix philosophy itself and why it is such an interesting and useful way of thinking about real life. And it's actually quite an antidote to some of the kind of consumerism trends that we're seeing from big companies pushing products on us that we didn't really ask for. The Unix philosophy itself is really well documented. You can read about it on Wikipedia, and it sort of explains these basic principles of do one thing and do it well, and composability, where the idea is you have specific tools that do very specific things, and the output of one tool is used as the input of the next tool. And the whole thing is just much more maintainable and effective as a result of using that approach. So let's look at 4 areas where I think this has worked really well for me over the last couple of years as I've transitioned away from using convergence or convenience products to more specific intentional versions. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is cars, and this is actually an interesting one because in a way, I fell for it. I fell for the convenience idea of getting a Tesla. I actually had 2, the Model Y being the kind of ultimate representation of the ultimate convergence device vehicle. It does so many things well. It's the performance of a sports car, the utility of an SUV, just everything you kind of want, and almost ticking the economics box as well. If you keep it for a really long time, the fuel savings from it being an EV kind of actually make it sensible. And obviously the maintenance side of things, it does present itself as being a very compelling vehicle. And, I bought into that, and I still do buy into that, but the point is it is still a very expensive thing. And of course there are so many cheap old EVs on the market now that the economic argument for the Tesla kind of falls down in that regard. So if you want a vehicle to be affordable, then clearly the Tesla isn't the way to achieve that. So I've moved away from that, and I've sold the Tesla, and with the equity I had back in that, I bought 2 specialist vehicles. I bought a Land Rover Discovery as our long distance adventure vehicle that we use for camping, and then I bought a cheap EV. At the time it was a Nissan Leaf, and I've now changed that to the Hyundai Ioniq, the 2021 one with the 39 kilowatt battery, which is so efficient it'll do 200 miles of range, which makes it pretty much the perfect EV daily driver when affordability is the main goal for that vehicle. And then of course the Land Rover is perfect for the long distance cruising, and it's so good at the adventure side of things. It can have the roof tent on the top, and it's got all the space for our camping setup with the fridge and the induction hob and the sleeping platform inside and all of these ideas. Those 2 vehicles do a better job of the roles we need them to do than the Tesla did. So this is the way I'm exploring that. And of course, this idea of composability and doing one thing well extends right the way through to the overall approach to the vehicles as well. So the Land Rover, we use a roof tent on the top. This is 2 ideas. The Land Rover is the great vehicle. It's not compromised by trying to be a camper, but it can have the roof tent on its roof, which gives us that ability to quickly turn it into a camper without the compromise. So this idea of we're actually going further and using this composability and individual items to build this whole experience together. And the sleeping platform inside that I built for that car, of course, I could rebuild that for other cars easily using the same principles as well. So this whole approach of turning it into the kind of overlander is also based on these principles of composability and do one thing and do it well. And the same thing kind of applies to the Ioniq. The whole point of a vehicle for doing the school run is that it needs to be affordable, it needs to be reliable. And it's a daily driver, so it gets parked in car parks, it gets people slamming the door into it and denting it. So in some sense, there is actually a real benefit to it literally having less value in its own right as well. And from an engineering perspective, this is a really interesting vehicle. It has a proper Type 2 charger, unlike the Leaf. It's incredibly efficient. It still has a small battery, which means it's light. It's no heavier than a normal car. So because we're supplementing it with the Land Rover, it doesn't need to have this 300+ mile range for those rare times you need it, which is of course why you might justify something like a Tesla for the times you need those long journeys. In reality, most of the daily driving doesn't need anything like that range. So we can bring that maximum range right down and explore this zone where the efficiency can really become quite optimal. The efficiency of the Ioniq is way more efficient than a Tesla. I'll get 6 miles to the kilowatt hour out of this in good conditions. I tell this to people who've got sort of more modern EVs, and their minds are blown. It's phenomenally efficient, and that means it can get this 200-mile range in a car that's really affordable to buy. You can pick these up for probably under about £10,000 now. For a car that has enough miles left in it to last 10 years. Like, the economics of this are staggering. So this is the perfect affordable daily driver. And of course, because we have that reliable car there, it means we don't need to pursue reliability in the other car. So we can take a little bit of a gamble and do something like get the Land Rover. And that in itself has been really fascinating. I do all the mechanics and maintenance on it myself. And, I think that's the only way to make this even remotely affordable. If I was to use a garage for the maintenance of the Land Rover, it would become way too expensive for the role that it is. But because we don't need to prioritize efficiency and cost per mile costs on that vehicle, because we're doing much fewer miles on it, we can get an older diesel car. So this kind of harmony of when you focus your requirements in specific directions, you start to realize that there are so many options that tick these boxes. All you've got to do is think of not having all of your requirements in one thing. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is multi-tools, and of course this was the basis for a dedicated video I did on this, exploring the role of the Leatherman versus the tools that it sets out to replace, which are in total still much lighter and way more affordable than the Leatherman. And obviously then, because they're purpose-specific tools for specific jobs, they do those things even better than the Leatherman did as well. Now, I'm a big EDC enthusiast. I think a lot about what it is that I carry in my pockets versus in my bags or in a vehicle. So I've kind of used this idea of augmentation as a way of deciding what it is that I actually have in my pockets. This idea of the super fast access. This is why I carry the tools that I do in my pockets. So the knife, the torch, the notebook and pen, the pry bar and the Zippo, all interestingly have huge flexibility in the way they can be used, but they are actually single devices in their own right. So they're sort of naturally very versatile, but not as a result of being a multi-tool or trying to do lots of different things in one device. They're all still separate devices. So I don't carry a Leatherman, I don't carry a Swiss Army knife, and I have obviously explored using these devices, but the reality just keeps coming back to the fact that if you distribute your requirements among individual items, you get a better overall experience. Each thing is better at doing the thing it sets out to do, and you can mix and match these items to tune the overall experience without sort of having to find a whole new device and replace the whole thing. And of course that life cycle and obsolescence comes into this hugely. The idea of having to replace one device that does lots of things just because one element of that is no longer useful to you, we'll get more onto this when we talk about smartphones, is quite important here. I've changed my knife several times over without needing to worry about the other items in my pockets here, which isn't something that could be said when you're sort of considering multi-tools. So one point to make about this in regards to multi-tools is quite often the multi-tools will have one defining feature that kind of rides the whole purpose for it. So with the Leatherman, you've got pliers, useful, heavy pliers. And with Swiss Army knives, you've got scissors. And it's almost those two things are actually almost worth carrying the thing for. But of course, you're still then carrying all of this heavy extra stuff. It's almost like you just want the scissors, the Victorinox scissors in a tiny little leather pouch that you can slip into a pocket. That would be actually all I want from the Victorinox. And of course, Swiss Army knives are very light and very pocketable. So you could make the case for just finding one of the smallest ones that almost only has scissors and just keeping it for that purpose. But then it's usually always got the knife as well, and then you have this redundancy between having a really good knife and then the sort of rubbish one on the Victorinox. You can't open them one-handed. So we start to see compromises coming in as soon as the device does more than one thing. The one-handed opening thing was a criteria for my knife, in fact, that really sort of tuned the direction I went with that. So I ended up with the Spyderco because it's just so good for that fast one-handed access. And I make that case for all of the items I carry in my pockets. That is why they are useful, is because I can get them out so quickly. It just extends my sort of way that I interact with the world around me. If I go into the garage and forget to bring a light, there's no light in the loft in the garage, so I'll go up the ladder and find out that it's dark. This happens to me all the time, the way my brain works. I'll go somewhere thinking I'll fail to prepare, but now I know I've got the torch in my pocket, and I can just get it out with one hand while the other hand is holding the ladder. If it took longer to get that out of my pocket, I'd probably just go back down the ladder and find a bigger torch or something. This is the thing, if it's not fast, it doesn't work. The next thing I'm going to talk about is decentralizing my smartphone. This is the big one. This is the one that sort of, we have this whole dumb phone movement, this digital minimalism movement, pioneered by Cal Newport's amazing books. These are just worth a read. Anyone who uses a smartphone should read his books. And I've really felt this. And this has been fascinating because I've done this to such a degree now that all I need from my smartphone is the functionality found in a 2016 iPhone SE. I don't need anything else because I have taken the roles that the modern phones have and decentralized them and you know, come up with specific things. So the timekeeping element, a lot of people just use their phones to check the time. Obviously, I can do that with my 2016 SE, but the experience is still less than just using a nice watch. And I use this for timers and countdowns and all of this. It does from here. I use it for the world time zone thing. I work with Chris in New Zealand on the software I make, which you should definitely check out. And this has this amazing world time feature where it pulls the correct time, always including considering whether it's daylight saving times or not, from Bluetooth through the smartphone actually, which is one of the important roles of the smartphone. And it will just always display this, you know, accurately. This is just so much nicer than getting the phone out and sort of swiping through it and then being distracted. Of course, this is the key point with the smartphone thing. A lot of people use smartphones for torches. Of course, I mentioned the proper torch that I keep in my pocket as well. So that element, I've now just got a far superior torch always in my pocket than the one on the phone. Cameras, I carry the Lumix S9. I love really high quality sort of pictures and videos, and I want the EDC camera to be that high level of quality. I'm sort of done with this, you know, every year we're supposed to believe that the iPhone is finally good enough to sort of meet these requirements, but of course it isn't. You know, there's always a compromise. One of the lenses has got a rubbishy sensor. Yeah, every year they improve one element of it, but it's sort of like this has been happening for 20 years now or whatever. Every year they sort of admit that the last ones were rubbish. This concept of, you know, it's by definition they're proving that they're never good enough. All you've got to do is think ahead 1 year, and then you realize the one they're trying to flog you now is going to be junk. You know, you buy a lens for a camera now that was made 10 years ago, it's still just as good. There are also, of course, huge advances being made in proper cameras as well. The Lumix S9 now that I'm using is a fairly modern camera, and that's primarily for its video capabilities. Obviously a lot of innovation has happened in video, but these have been pushed by sort of shifts towards things like 4K, which of course means the previous standard is no longer kind of acceptable. So we do have these sort of industry driven advances that we do need to sort of obviously pay attention to and keep up with. These seem like fairly legitimate advances in technology, as opposed to the annual cycle of an iPhone that just makes these little improvements every time because it's basically impossible to do what they're trying to do, and they're just sort of slowly getting slightly better each time. Ultimately, it's a tiny sensor with a tiny lens that's always going to affect the overall ability of that camera. And of course, this whole discussion isn't just sort of trashing the idea of convergence devices. You know, it is amazing to see what they're doing, but the point is this is a £1,000 device that is obsolete after a year. This is the thing I'm exploring. You can skip this just by focusing on a decent camera that you can keep for several years. It still has huge value to somebody else. You can change these things. They don't depreciate that much. Whereas an iPhone is worth 10% of its original value after a few years. And I think that sort of says so much about this approach to technology. And this is something that I'm trying to pay more attention to now. Is this a product that I'm being told to buy because somebody is trying to invent a market, or is it a result of what people really want and what people really ask for? Did we ask for all of the other mental health problems that came with social media that obviously came as a result of us all having smartphones? And this is what the digital minimalism movement is all about. It's about understanding how much these things have destroyed our attention and then taking steps to decentralize and move away from that and use specific things for specific purposes rather than letting this thing govern all of our digital life. So I don't use a smartphone for music anymore either, and I'm moving towards my own library system on a computer upstairs that I can stream to any of my devices. I can put those files on an iPod. I can truly live the intentional music thing in the room where I've got my best speakers, and they're only connected to an iPod. I can connect Bluetooth to them as well, but there is something very rewarding about just putting an album on an iPod and then coming away from it. So you can't skip tracks. You have to just sit down and just enjoy the album. And if you want to skip or change, you've got to get up off the seat and go and do it. That in itself is hugely rewarding. It makes you appreciate the music more. So this kind of approach applies to all of these areas. Photography is so much more rewarding when you use a proper camera. Music is so much better when you sit down and enjoy it. And then computing, I use laptops when I do real computing. I think sort of thinking you can do stuff on a smartphone, you end up just doing it all the time with one hand. It's this inferior way of doing things that should be done on a computer. And we just fall for it because of the convenience. And then there's gaming, of course, sort of moving away from thinking of the phone as a thing to play games on and actually just getting an Xbox controller and then a subscription to Xbox Live and doing that on the telly, which is a 55-inch OLED, on the comfortable sofa. This is the better experience for gaming when I have a bit of time for gaming. So once you take all of those things out of the equation, what you're left with is a set of requirements from the smartphone which were met 10 years ago by smartphones. It's things like sort of Bluetooth connectivity, like I said, to connect to my watch here. These are genuinely useful things. We have a sort of Bluetooth bridge between another device and the internet or some other sort of source of data or hardware. So things like my slider I use for the B-roll, put the camera on, that is controlled by the smartphone. Paying for parking in car parks, it all uses an app. There is this benefit to having sort of an app ecosystem in small pocketable computing devices. And I think that is the role of these things. And I think then once you sort of leave the line there, then you realize you actually don't need anything like this constant upgrade cycle of modern phones. They were good enough years ago. The only reason we have to change now is because some of those app developers stopped supporting those old hardware. They're sort of arbitrary decisions made by the developers, which is a little bit annoying, but I think we're probably operating at about a 10-year lifespan for this kind of thing, so I can kind of make my peace with that. So then we've got actual computing in terms of software and hardware, and the decisions I'm making there that pull the Unix philosophy ideas and put them into my day-to-day sort of computing process. So obviously this kind of builds on the idea of the smartphone and taking the role of computing tasks away from the smartphone and using something like the 12-inch MacBook, again, an old computer with very little power, but for what it does, it's perfect. It kind of replaces the phone around the house for me when I need to do some kind of computing tasks. I can just comfortably sit it on my lap. It's got a real keyboard that I can type on using the custom layout that I use. It's just so much better than trying to type anything on a smartphone. Like it's the perfect tool for the job for this kind of household computing device. It's £200 on eBay. Again, super affordable because you're not trying to make it do all the things that a smartphone does as well. And then upstairs, I've set up a more permanent computing system that uses hard drives connected to it, and then I'm running custom DIY software on that machine that will make all of my kind of stuff accessible on my local network. So I've built a music library app that shares my MP3s to any device using a web browser interface. In the same way, I've done this with my photo library tool, so it uses my real photos and then builds this using this composability idea, uses lots of open source libraries and some scripts that pull them all together to create a fully fledged photo library with raw processing support and video grading support and all of this stuff. And I can access that library from any device on my own network. And I even have support for sharing albums for friends and family, where it pushes up static HTML and assets to a VPS. So this huge power in DIY software. By the way, the full version of all these scripts that I'm talking about is available to members of this channel. So if you can jump in and explore the kind of things. There's tons of stuff on there. It's always growing. The other one is email. I'm moving away from the Apple email. I've built my own version of that again, which I can access from any of my devices. But it all comes from just syncing mailboxes from one machine. So this is a really interesting way of sort of thinking about this whole approach, is just having one more powerful machine to do the heavy lifting. And then, of course, the way that I build all of these software tools is very much based on this Unix philosophy. You find an open source library that does the thing that you want, and then you compose it into a bigger tool by using a bit of scripting. And so you can create these workflows and these tools based on this approach in real life on any device. Like all of these libraries are cross-platform. They'll work on Mac, Linux, and Windows. This is just such a better way of thinking about computing. And this whole approach of hosting a sort of web-based interface for these applications so that you can access it on your device over the network or even remotely as well, it's just really interesting and so much more powerful than relying on this kind of cloud-based, subscription-based thing that we're being fed all the time from the big players. So it's really about coming to realize over the years that there is a higher reward to be had than just seeking convenience. Convenience is a tool used to get us to buy things when they say one device or the next device can do more than the last one. It can do more than separate devices, and they use this to try and get us to buy the new thing when we didn't really necessarily ask for it in the first place. But more interestingly, the idea of convenience, which of course does have some utility, like it is kind of sometimes very appealing to have a single device do the role of multiple things. I can see the appeal, I can see the draw, but where I've kind of landed after experimenting and living with all of these ideas and sort of thinking them through is actually that the greater reward comes from improving this idea of intentionality, doing things more intentionally with more specific purpose-built items is the better reward than just pursuing convenience. And then this idea is really reinforced by the fact that the single purpose items are almost always way more affordable and usually more portable and lighter even than the single convenience convergence type device that sets out to replace them. Sometimes problems don't need fixing. If you've enjoyed this video, there's loads more like it on the channel. And there's always usually a few videos in members first that members can watch before everybody else. So there's never been a better time to become a member on this channel. Your support is hugely appreciated. You know, the ad revenue from YouTube is so hit and miss, and it's just been dwindling over the years. So memberships from people that value what I'm doing on this channel are just more appreciated than ever. If you become a master level member, you get full access to a whole suite of tools and scripts that I've built and all kinds of things, including the photo library and the email tool, which is coming very soon. If it's not already in the vault, it will be within a month or so of this video being made. I'll always have the password in the posts tab on my channel so that you can go and grab all of that. And it includes my Zettelkaster notes vault as well, which I've actually built an AI voice tool to turn it into a genuinely useful personal assistant. So you can ask a question and it will give you an answer after reading through all of the notes in there as well. So there's all kinds of stuff on there that you can have fun with. So obviously the idea with these tools and scripts is that you build on them and tune them for your own purpose and carry on sort of, you know, refining them for your specific requirements. But you will actually be able to get these up and running and use them in the way that I do. And I'm always working on them as well. And that's why it's great if you carry on your membership, because you get access to the newest version every month. I'll usually update once a month with the current versions of all these little tools that I use day to day now to move away from this idea of big tech governing the way we use computers in their own sort of ecosystems and app store subscription lock-in approach to computing. This is the way I see of breaking out of this. So thanks ever so much for thinking about being a member. I'll link to another video on the screen now, and I'll see you there.